Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Lamed Chet. Today's a very exciting day because Rabbanit Sarna's class, the third part in our series of Beginner's Guide to Learning Gemara, is starting today. All about how the logic of Gemara works. Okay, even if you don't still consider yourself a beginner, there's a lot of levels to be learning. So each year we try to add another element of background information that's helpful to know. So there'll be three different classes, each geared toward a different type of logic that you might meet in the Gemara. And that will be starting this evening. If you're listening to this after the class, no worries. Everything is recorded, digitally accessible on our site forever. So you can always access it later. But it's a free class. Registration is required. The only way to get into the classes is to register. So you can register on our website, find it on the homepage or just in the courses section of our website, and hope to see you all there. Okay, we're going to get started from the bottom of Daf Kuf Lamed Zayin. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Okay, so we started this yesterday, but I'm going to go back for a quick minute. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, we're going to have a machloka between him and Rabbi Yochanan, but then we're going to immediately say Rabbi Abba Bar Mama is going to come and say there's really no machloka. They were each talking about different situations. So Shmuel is quoted as saying, "Hakotev nechasav la'acher." Somebody writes his possessions to somebody else, gives rights to them. V'amar hala yefshi bahem, and the person says, "Thanks, but no thanks." Kana, they acquire it anyway. Even if they're screaming, "I don't want this, I don't want this," it's too bad. Which is a bit of a strange thing, and the Gemara will Rabbi Abba Bar Mama will modify this very shortly. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Kana. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Of course you don't acquire it. You said you don't want it. You can't. Someone can't force you to take a gift." So Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Mama. Rabbi Abba Bar Mama says, "Kam b'tzavech kara v'lo pligi." They don't actually argue. Kam b'tzavech mi'ikara, kam b'shotek mi'ikara. Kam b'shotek mi'ikara ulevasof tzavach. So it depends on what happened. If you scream immediately and say, "I'm not interested in this gift," of course you don't acquire it. You're able to prevent yourself from getting this gift. And the Rashban points out that even though we have this concept of zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, you can basically have someone acquire something even if they're not there. So theoretically, this person could gift it to you without you wanting it. But this is actually a chov. Why is it a chov? Well, we'll see later that it could be an actual chov because lots of times with gifts, you actually have to invest in them and invest time, invest money. We'll talk about slaves, for example. But also, but the Rashban points out, so people don't like getting gifts. It's not good to get gifts. First of all, you end up owing the person. Now, this person's about to die, but you might owe their family. Not everybody likes getting a gift is not always a good thing, even if the item is good to get, but the concept of accepting a gift, right? We're supposed to be people who despise accepting gifts. You can look right. All you have to do is look at politics to see about gift giving and all that, how complicated it gets. So if you immediately said, "I don't want this," of course you don't acquire it. But the other opinion, when Shmuel said you do acquire it, he was talking about a case where you were shotek mi'ikara. You immediately responded by silence. You didn't say, "I don't want this gift." And only after did you say, "I don't want it." Well, then it's too late. If you're silent when the gift comes to you, then, and you don't have any sort of response, then it becomes yours immediately. If you don't want to accept the gift, you have to say so immediately. And therefore, there's really no debate. I'm Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, though, now brings a different case, a kind of little bit of a small change, which makes a big difference. Zikalo al yedei achel v'shataku levasof tzavach banu lemachloket Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'Rabbanan. If you gave rights to this object by somebody else, meaning, let's say the person's on their deathbed, and there were three people in the room, the person on their deathbed, you, who is getting the gift, and someone else. And the person on their deathbed went to someone else, and said, "I'm giving you, I'm writing all my property to let's just use me as an example. It's a little easier, or let's go back to our Ruth and Naomi, maybe. So the person on their deathbed is writing their property to Ruth. But instead of giving the document to Ruth to acquire, they gave the document to Naomi on behalf of Ruth. So now what happened? Ruth didn't say anything when Naomi got the document. But when it came to Ruth to accept it, when it was already accepted on her behalf, because we know you can do that. You can give Ruth rights to something by giving it to somebody else on her behalf. And if she was there and didn't respond, but only responded later, then we have a debate between Rashbag, Rabban Shimon, Gamliel, and the rabbis. How do we know there's a machloket about this? So it's going to take a little time to figure this out. We're going to see they have a machloket about the issue in general. And then they're going to say, it can't be they're arguing over the two cases we already brought before. It must be the argument is about this particular scenario. So let's read it inside and we'll see how it goes. The time. So here we get back to the slaves that I mentioned, and that's what the Gemara hadn't discussed it yet. But someone writes all their possessions to another, wants to gift it, like we've been talking about, right? Wants to give them slaves. And the person says, listen, nice, you want to give me all your stuff, but I don't want the slaves. Right? It's a pain. I have to feed them, I have to deal with them, I have to train them. I don't want slaves. Now, the ramifications in this issue are not what we're talking about. I mean, they are kana or lo kana, but they're not talking about in that sense. They're talking about a different ramification. Now, let's say Ruth was a good example here. Ruth is a Kohen, and she comes from her family or Kohanim. So, right, the Ruth that happens to be in our class goes to the Ruth and Naomi, the biblical, which I'm not referring. Right? So, Ruth is from a family of Kohanim, which means that if the slave, remember we're talking about Canaanite slaves, if the slave goes into Ruth's possession and is actually acquired by her, the slave is allowed to eat truma, because when you're a slave in a Kohen's house, you get to eat truma. But if the person on their deathbed was not a Kohen, right, the slave can't eat truma until it becomes Ruth's possession. So now it's going to be very important, did Ruth possess the slave or not? Because if she did, then the slave can eat truma. If not, then not. So what happened here? Ruth said, I don't want this slave or these slaves. If Ruth's family was a family of Kohanim, it doesn't matter that Ruth said, I don't want them. Those slaves can eat truma. Why is that? Because, well, we're going to see. That's the problem. It seems weird. She said, I don't want them. How could they become hers? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kevan she'amar hala yefshi bahem kfar zachu bahen yoshim. So what happens? Well, first of all, okay, I forgot to say this, but it's very important to note, and it's obvious, that they can't eat truma immediately. They can only eat truma once the person dies. As soon as the person dies, since Ruth's comment of yefshi bahen was ineffective, which we'll have to figure out why in a minute, therefore, as soon as the person dies, Ruth gets to eat. Ruth's slave, they're now Ruth's slaves, and they get to eat truma. But Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, no. Ruth said, I don't want them. They're not hers, which means what happens at the person's death? They go immediately to their heirs. And we said the person on their deathbed wasn't a Kohen, so those slaves can't eat truma. Now, after this Braita was taught in the Beit Midrash, they started asking, V'tanakama afilu mevet sovech? How could Tanakama say, like, if Ruth was standing and screaming when she got the gift, she said, Yefshi bahen, and she was screaming, I don't want them, I don't want them. What? We're going to say they're hers and the slaves can eat truma? That makes no sense. So I'm a rabbi, v'item a Rabbi Yochanan, either Rabbi or Rabbi Yochanan said, I want you to remind you, Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said earlier, lo kana, but we said he really doesn't argue with Shmuel. They both agree about all these cases, which would make sense if this was Rabbi Yochanan saying this. If immediate reaction of Ruth to hearing that she's going to get all this money, and including the slaves, was that she said, no, thank you, I don't want the slaves, of course, nobody thinks that she acquires them. Of course, you could say no to a gift. If she was silent and only later was screaming, I don't want them, right? She doesn't have to actually scream, but they use it as a just a way of phrasing it. Everyone agrees that if she was silent at the moment when the person said, I'm giving this to you, and she didn't say anything, of course, she acquires the slaves. And then, of course, the slaves can eat truma. So then what's the machloket? And now we're going to go back to what we said before, which is, the machloket between them is in a case where Naomi was in the room and the person on their deathbed gave it to Naomi on behalf of Ruth, and Ruth was silent. And later, probably when the person died, She said, no, thank you. So now the question is, why is there a machloket? What's the source of the debate between the two? Did Tanakama saval midashatik kaninu? That's easy, right? Tanakama says, look, Ruth was in the room when Naomi got it. She heard that Naomi was getting it on her behalf. She should have screamed immediately. She didn't respond. She accepted it, and that's why they're hers. Behind the katsava, well, the fact, so how do we explain that she later was saying, I don't want them, I don't want them? She changed her mind. But it's too late to change her mind. Those slaves are already hers. Now, what can she do? She has a lot of things she could do. She doesn't want the slaves, sell them, give them as a gift to someone. I mean, there's other ways of getting rid of them, but she can't get rid of them simply by saying, I'm not interested in this gift. They're hers, they're owned by her, they can eat truma, okay, any relevant halacha applies. Rabban Shimon Gamliel, who said no, she can later complain and it's valid. Well, how can we explain his opinion? So Rabban Shimon Gamliel Savar, he held Hochiach Sofo al Tchilato. The end proved the beginning. What does that mean? When the person dies and Ruth says, I don't want these slaves, that proves she didn't even want them in the first place. Well, now we have to explain if she didn't want them in the first place. Why was she silent when the person on their deathbed gave it to Naomi on her behalf? The fact that she didn't complain until now was disavar kilo matu liadim mayat saver. It's not even in my property yet. Why am I going to start complaining about something that hasn't even come to me yet? Now, there's not only did the person on their deathbed not give it to me directly, right? Now, there's number one, it didn't even come to my property yet because the person's not dead. Number two, they gave it to someone else on my behalf. So it's removed from me at this point. Only when Naomi comes and gives it to me and says, here's the document that says you own the property, then I'll complain. But there's no reason to complain till it's actually in my hands. So therefore, Ruth can say, I didn't complain until now because it wasn't yet really mine. It was technically, but nothing was given to me yet. So when I'm going to start complaining, it was distanced from me. So if we have some sort of explanation, that's the whole uniqueness of this situation, which is since it was given to somebody else, Ruth can have an explanation as to why she didn't have an immediate reaction, why she was silent in the beginning. And that's why we have a debate, because it's not so clear. Can it really explain everything or not? So therefore, yes, and I was thinking about that, Tina, also, that perhaps she didn't want to distress the person who was dying. So maybe that's why. But that wouldn't help because that would then be in a case, even if it was directly given to her. So if it's directly given to her, she's expected to respond, even though we don't want to distress the dying person. So it can't be a good enough explanation. That was case number one today. We had talked, and how did we get to this? Because we had talked yesterday about gift giving, and yesterday's daf was all about getting gifts. We talked about gifts to return and all that, and then we talked about gifts. How does it work with accepting a gift or not accepting a gift? Now we're going to move on to we're going to have a whole bunch of cases of shchid me'ara and wording they may use, and how we're going to understand the wording used. So the first case is going to be relevant to what we call liened property. So if the person on their deathbed has a loan out, okay, all these cases are going to actually refer somehow to having owed money to someone. In this case, they owe money to someone. But when they give out their property and they say, I want to give this to this one, that to that one, the way it works with lien property is if someone was owed money by the deceased, they go, if the heirs, there's nothing left for the heirs, then they go to all the lien property. Now, what's the rule of lien property? You always go to the person who they sold to last. Okay, that's how it works. Okay, so if they had 3 pieces of property, let's say, and they sold first one, then the second one, then the third one, when the Baal Chov comes, the creditor comes, they collect from person number 3. Because person number 1 or 2 could say, hey, when I bought the land, there was still other land that could have been collected on account of that loan. So you can't take from me, go take from them. That's the way it works. So now we're talking about a shchid me'ara who had money, was giving away their money at their death. And they said, shchid me'ara, so it's a braita, tanu Rabbanan, shchid me'ara sha'amar, tnu 200 leploni, u300 leploni, va400 leploni. Okay, so he says, give 200 zuz to this one. then 200, 300 zuz to someone else, 400 zuz to someone else, and starts dividing up their property in that way. Now, the question is, according to what I just said, let's say a creditor comes. To who do they take the money from? Let's say they're owed 400 zuz. Can they go to the last person? Can they start with the first person? Okay. So based on what I said, they would only be able to go to the last person. Or let's say they were owed 600 to go to the last person and then the second to last person to collect the rest. But that's only if this was done in a particular order. Now, if this dead person wanted, the person on their deathbed wanted to give out the money in no particular order, but all at the same time, well, the person on their deathbed had no other way to say it other than 200 to this one, 300 to this one, 400 to that one. They can't say all at the same time, give 200 to this one, 300 to that one, 400 to that one. It's impossible, right? The way that we say Shamor v'Zachor b'Dibor Echad, that God said them both at the same time simultaneously. A human can't do that. You can't say those three things simultaneously. So there's no other way to word it other than wording it like that. In which case, we're going to say, Ein omrim kol hakodem b'shtar zocheh. We don't say whoever came first in the document gets, right, is considered the first one to have acquired. Lefichach yatza l'shtar chov goveh mikulam. And therefore, if a creditor came, he takes from each of them proportionally. Okay, so I'll give you the easy example to say this. If this is 900 zuz altogether, right, because 200, 300, and 400. Let's say the person was owed 9 zuzim. Okay, so what would they do? They would take 4 from the one who got 400, 3 from the one who got 300, and 2 from the one who got 200. Okay, and you don't take equally from all of them, but equally according to the proportion of what they received. Okay, so that's what you would do because they're all considered as if they received at the same time. However, aval amal tnuma times zuz leploni, v'acharav leploni, v'acharav leploni. But if you say 200 zuz to this one, and then after to this one, and then after to that one, where it was clear the person on their deathbed wanted it to be in a particular order, then omrim kol hakodem b'shtar zocheh. Whoever's earlier wins, meaning lefichach yatza alav shtar chov goveh min ha'acharon. So if there was money owed by the deceased, they're going to collect it from the last person, and only if they need to, they'll go to the second, and only if it's not enough to cover the loan, they'll go to the third. Ein lo, right? That's what we say here. Ein lo, if there's not enough with the last one, goveh mishilefanav. Then they'll go to the one before. Ein lo, if there's not enough to cover it, goveh mishilefnei panav. Now, why did they bring an example of 200, 300, 400? Why didn't they bring an example of 200, 200, 200? Right? What did we gain by talking about the 200, 300, 400? So what we gained was, or the reason why they had to bring that case is that if it was 200 to each, then there is a way the person could have said it to each one of them at the same time. The person could have said or written, give to all three, right? Divide 600 zuz equally between the following three people. And therefore, if it was 200, 200, 200, and they did it, give 200 to this one, 200 to that one, 200 to that one, it would probably be, the commentaries comment that it would be the same as 400 to the 200 to this one, and then 300 to this one, and then because there was a way that it could have been said. So that's why this case must have been brought. Tana Rabbanan, next case of divrei shchimira that we're not sure what they meant. And all these cases, they're going to owe someone to this person. And in addition, they're going to talk about giving them an amount of money. So the first one is a firstborn. Firstborn gets the firstborn portion, the double portion. So shchimira shamal tnuma times zuz leploni. It's also braita, Tana Rabbanan. We're having a braita. Shchimira shamar tnuma times zuz leploni b'ni b'chor kara oilo. This is a bit of a weird language. You say, I'm giving 200 zuz to my firstborn son as is appropriate for him. Okay, what does that mean? Well, notzlan v'notel b'chorato. This must be a gift in addition to the firstborn portion. So basically, before the inheritance gets divided and the firstborn gets 2 portions and the others get the rest, we're going to take out this additional 200 zuz and first give it as a gift to this firstborn. But if he said, imamal, bibechorato, give 200 zuz for the firstborn as his double portion. Now, his double portion might be worth more, it might be worth less. Okay, it might not be worth exactly 200 zuz. So what is meant by this? Yado ala elyona, ratzano tlan, ratzano tel bechorato. The bechor can choose one or the other. They can say, oh, my father didn't have a lot of money. My double portion is less than 200 zuz. Remember, 200 is about 1 year's worth of money for the year for food and stuff like that. That's why a virgin is promised 200 ketubas in her, 200 zuz in her ketubah. So, right, basic living expenses. So if the double portion is not going to be a full year's worth of living expenses, which is very likely because right, not everybody was think about how much people stored up of their wealth in those days. So the Bechor can choose either I'll take the 200 zuz because maybe that's more money, or I'll take the double portion, which is more than 200 zuz. And similarly, Shchimera Shamar Tnu 200 zuz leplonit ishti karaoila. The Shchimera who says give 200 zuz to my wife as is appropriate for her. No tatan vino teletek tubata. Again, sounds like it's a gift because he didn't say for her ketubah. So she gets her ketubah as well. She gets this 200 zuz and she gets her ketubah money. But imamar big ketubata. But if he says for her ketubah, turning out to amubet, yadala el yona ratzano tatan ratzano telek ketubata. So she has the upper hand. She can either take it or she can take her ketubah. Again, depending on which one is more. You might say ketubah is always 200 zuz. But first of all, sometimes women got parts of their ketubah in their lifetime. Sometimes, if they weren't a virgin, they only got 100 zuz. So there could be cases when that was it. That was more. By the way, they could also choose to take less. It's possible, but I don't know why they would. And third case, if a person on their deathbed says, give 200 zuz to this person who I owe money to, he's a creditor of mine, as is appropriate, no tatam vino telet chavo. Again, he didn't say on behalf of what I owe him or her. So therefore, basically the Baal Chov, the creditor, can come collect the 200 zuz and what they're owed. But imamar bichovo, no tzlam bichovo. This is a little bit of a confusing language. There happens to be a bunch of different versions as to what is said here. And if you notice, it's already different from the other two cases. What this says, if he said for what I owe this creditor, then the creditor takes that money for what the creditor is owed. It's a little bit confusing language. What it seems to mean, and there's even a version that says this a little bit much more clearly, which is it means that if the person was, let's say, owed only 150, then you only give the creditor 150. They can't take the 200. Okay, and then that's different from the others. Why is it different? Well, first of all, some versions don't think it's different, and they actually have a different version here that says, Yado al Elyonah, the Baal Chov could choose either take what I'm owed or take the 200 zuz. But you might want to say it's different because what they say here is, right, no telet chavo v'dilma. Oh, sorry, no. So some people explain that the reason, or one could explain, I'm not sure if I saw this, but I thought in my head that the difference is that it could be to a creditor, the person doesn't really have any real need to be giving extra money to them. So probably what they really meant is for what I owe them, maybe they didn't remember what they owed the person, and therefore the creditor doesn't get to take more. If it's the wife or the firstborn son, that's a relative of theirs that might have wanted to just give more money to, and therefore the person could choose which one they want, and it could be it meant more. That's one possibility. But again, some people think it's no different, and the halacha is the same. Like I said, there's different versions. Now the Gemara is going to ask a question on all three cases, on the reisha, the first part of all three cases, which is if you say kara oilo, that then the person gets to take both. So the Gemara says, Mishum amar kara oilo, no tzalam v'no telet chavo. How could that be? Just because you said as is appropriate to them, that means that they get both. And think about it. There's other people vying for the money. This is a little bit like Hamotzi mechaber alav haraya, right? Doesn't there need to be clear proof that that's what the person meant? It's not clear when you said as that person is deserving of. It could mean as they're deserving of on account of their firstborn status, the wife of the ketubah, could be. So how could that be? And the Baal Chov also, like someone who's a creditor, what, they're going to get a double payment? Maybe it really meant as is appropriate for what they are owed. The firstborn for the firstborn portion, the woman for the ketubah, and the creditor for what I owe the creditor. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Lihuna, we're going to see this phrase twice today, where Rav Nachman, two totally different sugyot, where Rav Nachman says, Huna explained to me. Why does he call him Huna and not Rav Huna? Well, first of all, Huna was younger than Rav Nachman, and also he was a colleague of his, but also a younger colleague. So Huna explained to me, Hamane Rabbi Akiva he Didayek Lishna Yatera. This Braita, and the reason why they say this is because it goes like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva darshaned, or right, I say that because Rabbi Akiva was always darshaning every et. It's interesting, there's similar comparison here. Anytime anyone adds wording, we assume they're adding, if it's unnecessary wording in a business transaction, or right here, it's a promise, a commitment, which is totally unnecessary. Why do you need to say kara oilo? Just said I'm giving 200 zuz. Well, if you add the words kara oilo, it must be said to add something additional. And that's why kara oilo is explained as something additional. The person gets more. Where do we know this? You might remember this. We learned it earlier in the Masechet. Ditnan. It says in Daf Samach Gimel Samach Dalet, if you buy a house, if you remember, a simple sale of a house without specifying all the details does not include the bore or the dut, right? The ditches in the pits in the yard. Velo tabor velo tadut. Even if you say I'm selling you the house, the depths and to the heights, it doesn't include things that are dug into the ground like a ditch or a pit. And not only that, if you remember, not only does it mean, well, it means when I sold you the house, I'm keeping the board to myself. However, I still have to buy myself a walkway to there because mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Remember, when I sell something, I sell generously, according to Rabbi Akiva, whereas the rabbis disagree. We'll see that in a second. But we're not yet up to the point that we want to get to in Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis say, what do you mean? Why would I sell you my property, leave myself part of it, and now I have to spend more money to buy myself a path? That would be crazy. Of course, I retain for myself a path, and that's because mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. Someone who sells, only what needs to be sold. And if I'm going to be more stingy about it, I'm going to keep for myself a path to get to my board. It doesn't make sense that I wouldn't. Here comes the key line, though. Modeh Rabbi Akiva b'zman she'amar lo chutz me'elu she'eno tzarich likach lo derech. But Rabbi Akiva admits, agrees with the rabbis, in a case where if I said I'm selling you the house without the bor and the dud, now I have no need to add those words because any sale of a house does not include the bor or the dud. So if I added those words, I obviously meant that I want something more. What does it mean then? Right? I said not this. Not this can't mean not this. It must mean not something more than that, which means not the path. You're getting the house without the path. I get to keep the path. So it's going to be a little tricky because adding in each case is going to be different. In this case, it's adding to the not this. So therefore, it's going to be less that I'm selling you. In our case, it's going to be more because I added words to what I'm giving. And therefore, I'm going to be giving more. Okay, so, right, whereas here I'm actually giving less, but that's because I'm added the words not. So we're adding more to the not. Since I didn't need to say not the bor, not the dud, I must be adding on something more that I'm not including. Likewise here, also here, since I didn't need to say kara oilo, I must be adding some additional payment. So if it's a man to his firstborn son or a man to his wife, remember, it can't be a woman to her firstborn son because there is no bechorah for the firstborn son of a woman. But if the firstborn only gets a double portion of his father's portion, so in these two cases, and in addition, a creditor, which could be man or woman, there, if the person said kara oilo, it must be they added those extra words to be adding something, and this all follows Rabbi Akiva's position. Not everybody would agree with this Braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to our last case. We'll probably stop before the Mishnah today. We're going to have as a case, and then we're going to have a machlok at Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and then we're going to have Rav Nachman again is going to tell us that Huna said he had a different version of the debate. So we're going to see two versions of a debate. This is a totally different case, except it has to do with the Shchid Meirah and saying something on their deathbed. But instead of saying I'm giving out my property, the Shchid Meirah here says somebody owes me money. So while the person's on their deathbed, they say the following: I have 100 zuzim in someone's property, meaning they owe me money. Now, we have no idea if the Shchid Meirah, right? In general, we say Shchid Meirah, right? Divrei Shchid Meirah kechtuvim u'chemesurim dami. That's when the Shchid Meirah wants to give out property. So we'd say it as if it's a done deal. But if the Shchid Meirah tells us someone owes them money, we don't know if that's true or not, right? He doesn't give us any proof. She doesn't give us proof. We just have the words of the Shchimera saying, someone owes me money. So the question is, if you're standing there near the deathbed, can you, as a witness, write a document and sign it with two witnesses saying, the Shchimera said that someone owes them money? Now, whether or not you can do this depends on how will that document be viewed in court. If they take it seriously, because it's a document signed by two witnesses, then we're going to tell you you can't write it because you don't know if it's true or not. But if the court anyway is going to look into it because they're going to say it's just a document that two witnesses said the guy said this on his deathbed, well then, and they'll look into it, then yeah, you can write it because anyway, when the kids go to collect, they'll have to prove it. So that's basically the machloket we're going to see. Ha'edim kotvim afa pisha emikirim. Okay, so first point, this is Rabbi Meir, we're going to see in a minute. Rabbi Meir says that witnesses can write it even if they don't know if there's really a loan or not. And therefore, lefichach kishu govet tzarich lavi raya. Now, it's kind of a little different than I said, but it works like this. Because we allow witnesses to write this without checking into the details, therefore, when the children go to collect it, they have to prove it to the court that this is really a loan and it wasn't just made up, that the person, or it doesn't have to be a loan, it could be just any kind of situation where the person owes money to the deceased. That's Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim ein kotvin elim kemikirim. These witnesses are not allowed to write. You can't write a document that may be false, right? Again, it sort of depends, I guess, how you write it. But even if you say the person said on their deathbed that someone owes money, and then witnesses sign, it looks like it's an official document that you could collect money based on, because why are witnesses signing if not that they checked into things? Witnesses usually have to have a certain, they have to be honest, and it's hard to write something that's just based on hearsay alone. So because of that, so if you were to see a document signed in court that said two witnesses signed on a document saying that deceased said someone owes the money, the court can collect based on that because we can make an assumption that the witnesses checked into it before they wrote it down. So you have this very interesting machloket about what they're arguing is really two things. Number one, can the document be written? And then the ramifications of that. Well, if the document can be written without checking into details, then a court can't ever take this too seriously and has to look for further proof. If it can't be written without looking into, then the court actually can accept any document like this and not require the heirs to have further proof, and then they can go collect this money. That's the first version of the machloket. But Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Lihuna, Tana, but Rav Nachman says, the Huna told me, this is the way the Braita should read. I have a different version of that Braita. Rabbi Meir omer ein kotvin, v'chachamim omrim kotvin. Rabbi Meir says this type of document cannot be written, okay? Not like Rabbi Meir said in the first version. And the rabbi said this kind of document can be written. And their machloket is a little bit different than what we thought before. It's not that we switch positions here, but af Rabbi Meir lo amar ela mishum beitin to'in. Rabbi Meir theoretically thinks you can write. And Rabbi Meir actually fits somewhat with what Rabbi Meir said before, which is theoretically they could write even though they don't check. And when a court gets a document like this, they should check into it. But we're worried about a beitin to'in. We're worried that there might be a court that doesn't know the law perfectly, which shouldn't really happen, but could happen. And we're worried that if a court sees a document signed by two witnesses, they might think it's valid and they might not check into the details. And therefore, even though theoretically you could write this because most courts are going to know and they're going to check the details, but you have to worry that maybe the court won't, and therefore best not to write this document at all. So if you didn't check into the details, you shouldn't write the document because a beitin down the road might think that this is an official document because it's signed by two witnesses, and they might collect money based on that. And the rabbis who said you can write it is because they're not worried about beitin to'in. Now, here the rabbis seem to be having a different approach, which is you can write it even without checking into the details because you're not worried. Every court is going to basically check into the details. And that's different from what the rabbis said before. At least it seems like that's what the rabbis would be saying. So Amarav dimi min hardeh hilchata ein choshishin lebeitin to'in. So Rav Dimi min hardeh says we're not worried about beitin to'in, even though Rabbi Meir was worried about it. Rav Dimi min hardeh says we're not worried about it, which means that basically you can write this document no matter what, even if you don't know the details, because every court is going to look into it. No court is going to assume, because the document says the two witnesses testified to the fact that the Shchiv Meirah on their deathbed said, someone owes me money. There's no concern that the court's going to act upon that without checking into the details. So that's the way we rule, and that's like the Chachamim in Rav Huna's version. Kotvim, you can write this even though you didn't check into the details, because we're not worried that a court's going to make a mistake like that and not check into it. Because courts are courts, right? That's what their job is, to be careful. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute though, we have a case where we have two courts, okay? And a later court is going to rely on the earlier court and might rely on them making a mistake. And therefore, we require the earlier court to know their stuff, which is similar. Okay, it's a little different, and that's what we're going to say. But in our case, we don't make the witnesses do their homework properly because we assume that the later court will not rely on them. But in the next case, we're going to see, we require the first court to do their research properly so that the later court doesn't rely on a mistake. Okay, and we're worried the second court is not going to do their homework properly. So why, in the case with the witnesses, do we assume that the Beit Din is going to check into things thoroughly, but when it's a court before them, they're not going to check thoroughly? And that you can figure out, obviously, why there's a distinction, but we'll get to that soon. So that's what we're going to compare now. Why is this different from what Rava said? Da'amar Rava. Ein chotzin elaim ke mikirin. Ve'ein memanim elaim ke mikirin. Case comes to the court, a woman has to do chalitza. She comes to the court, they don't know her. They don't know the person she's with. She comes to the court, she says, listen, my husband died without children. This is his brother. We're going to do a tekas chalitza right now. The woman comes, the man comes, it doesn't matter. Two people come into court, they say, we have to do chalitza. Comes Rav and says, the court can't do chalitza with this woman. Now, what's the issue? Well, she's going to want to get married down the road, and she can't get married till she performs chalitza. So she claims this is the brother-in-law, but who knows? Maybe it's not the brother-in-law. The Beit Din has to do their check to make sure this is really the brother-in-law. Otherwise, she's not really doing a tekas chalitza. She could claim, based on this testimony, I'm done. I took care of my chalitza responsibility, but maybe it's not really the brother, the brother-in-law, the brother of her husband. So the Beit Din has to do their proper checking to investigate and make sure this is the woman and this is with her husband, because otherwise what will happen? If they go to if she goes a year or two later, she wants to get remarried and she pulls out, here's my document from the court, I did chalitza. What's the situation? We're going to assume that court isn't going to start interrogating and figuring out who did she do chalitza with. They have a document from the court that verifies she did chalitza. They assume the earlier court checked into it. And that's why the earlier court has to check into it. Because there's no real issue if the chalitza was done properly or not right now for this first court. It's only what's going to happen later when she goes to get remarried. But when she goes to get remarried based on this document, right, they're not going to check into what happened with the chalitza then. So therefore, the first court is under an obligation to check everything thoroughly before they issue their ruling that this woman did chalitza. And same thing with miyun. What's miyun? Might remember this from Nashim. Those who learn Seder Nashim, comes up a lot there. It's a very interesting situation. Okay, and strange for us to understand because we don't do this kind of things anymore. But a father can betroth a daughter under the age of 12 if he wants. And she is betrothed by Torah law. And if she wants to get out of that, she needs a get. Because she's already betrothed, you need get even from betrothal, right? Which is really like engagement, but not our engagement, a halachic engagement. Now, if the father's not in the picture, either is abroad, not dealing with his family at all, or dead, then the mother or the brother can betroth the daughter if they want, but only on a rabbinic level. It's not by Torah law, and therefore she doesn't need a get. If she wants to get out of the marriage, well, she'll need a get later. Once she becomes of age, she then becomes married to this person, ka'halacha. But there's a window of time where she can say, I don't want to be married to this man. That's called miyun. Miyun is refusal. And by her words alone, it's a fascinating thing, she's out of the marriage. She doesn't need to get, nothing. She just says, EF Shibo or something like that, I don't want him. And she's out of the marriage. Apropos the gift kind of thing that we were talking about before. So very different. But she can say that and be out. But you have to you have to say it in front of witnesses. So what they're saying here is when the court valifies a miyun, or she can't do it, right? So they can't allow this kind of thing to go on unless they've checked into it to make sure This is the person she's betrothed to. They have to see who these people are and make sure it's all that it was only a betrothal that the mother and the brother did. They have to check into all the details. So now, since the first court can only do these actions with checking into it properly, therefore, if there were witnesses to a ceremony that took place in a court regarding these issues, the witnesses can write a document that says, we saw tekes chalitza, we saw get miyun, this woman was mema'enet. She's free to marry anyone she wants. I mean, that's the ramifications of it. This woman did chalitza. And because it was done in front of a court, we can assume it was done properly. So now, my love, mishum dechoshashin the beitin toin. Now, why do we say ein chotzilem kemikirim? Why does the first beitin have to thoroughly research it? Because otherwise, witnesses would say we saw get chalitza being done, we saw miyun tekes being done, and then this woman will go get married. She'll go to the next court. She'll produce this document signed by witnesses. And the court will say, oh, great, you're done. And they'll go marry her off. And maybe no one checked into it properly. So aren't we worried about a Beit Din tone that they won't check into the details and they'll marry this woman even though, right, they'll let her get married even though maybe really she wasn't properly chalitzad or miyun? So what do we answer? Lo. Beidina, batar beidina, lo daike. Because it was done in a court, that's why we assume they're not going to check, right? A Beit Din would never check on another Beit Din because they would assume that the Beit Din must have done it properly. And therefore, the first Beit Din has to do it properly, right? It's kind of because there's an assumption that the later court will rely on the earlier court has to do all the research properly, even though at that moment there's no ramifications. The woman's not getting remarried. But since the later court who's going to remarry her is not going to look into the details and not reopen the case. But Beit Dina batar edim daike. But if it's just witnesses saying this person said he was owed money, well, of course they're going to check into that. And therefore, these are two very different things. I just want to point out that nowadays in the courts in Israel, for sure, and even abroad in many places, they don't always rely on previous Beit Dins, and they start questioning and raise all sorts of doubts. And, people struggle with this. I mean, this is in my husband's work at team. This goes on all the time where they'll say, oh, well, who's to say that Beit Din was reliable? And who's to say that? Here you see in the Gemara, that's not the case. Beit Din, it's in the court. You assume it was done properly and you can just move on from there. And don't start questioning this woman's status and really was her divorce okay or not. There's a lot of, suspicions these days about all sorts of things. But then, obviously, or at least according to the answer of the Gemara, there was really no reason for concern that a Beit Din would check into another Beit Din. So that was the second version of this debate between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, which in the end they say we hold like the rabbis, that we are concerned when it's witnesses, although we aren't, right? We're concerned, we're not concerned for a Beit Din towing, because the Beit Din won't make a mistake when it's witnesses, they'll always check into it. But when it's a court, they won't check into it, and that's why the first court has to be held to a certain standard, whereas these witnesses don't have to check into the details because they know that someone later will check into it. Okay, so with that, we'll do a quick review. We started with Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan about if someone says, I don't want a gift, is it acquired or not? And then we said they really don't argue. It's all about were they first silent and then said, I don't want it, or immediately. And then we said, well, there is a machloket, though, if it was given to someone else on their behalf and they didn't respond, because perhaps, right, two opinions, but perhaps they weren't expected to respond until it actually got to them, since it wasn't really directly given to them. Then we talked about the person who said to you, then you, then you, and depending on how it was written, right, would we say that a creditor collects from the last person or maybe collects from them all equally proportionally? Then we got to the case of adding the words cover oilo. I'm giving a gift to my bechor or to my wife or to someone who I owe money to, cover oilo, as right there as they are as is appropriate for them, because he added these words. We said that's Rabbi Akiva, who holds any added word means they're giving them something additional. But if it says for the bechorah, for the obligation, all that, then it's a different story. Then it's either or for the Baal Chov, perhaps differently, that it's only one option. Then we had but it's certainly not both. And then we had the last case about which we had two versions of this machlok of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. If two people here say someone owes me money, are they allowed to write it down? And that's all because we have to look at the future. What are the expectations of what the power of this document will be? So are they allowed to write it down without checking into the details, or do they have to check into the details before they write it down? And we saw two different versions of this machlok of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. And then we had to distinguish between court after court or court after witnesses. And with that, we'll finish today's daf and wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.